Hello friends, welcome to the world of Chhuti Presents Escape into Audio Stories in English. We will read stories primarily of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Southeast Asian origin and in English language. We'll try to read in neutral accent as much as possible and with our best attempts. We will focus on literature for kids and children. Today we are going to read Letters from a Father to His Daughter by Jawaharlal Nehru. Letter 7. The Early Men. We saw in our last letter that the chief difference between man and the other animals was the intelligence of man. This intelligence made him cleverer and stronger than enormous animals who'd otherwise have destroyed him. As man's intelligence grew, so also grew his power. To begin with, man had no special weapons to fight his enemies. He could only throw stones at them. Then he began to make out of stone axes, spears, and many other things, including fine stone needles. We saw many of these stone weapons in the South Kensington Museum and also in the museum in Geneva. The Ice Age, about which I said something in my last letter, slowly ended and the glaciers disappeared from Central Europe and Asia. As it became warmer, men spread out. In those days, there were no houses or other buildings. People lived in caves. There was no cultivation, that is, working in the fields. Men ate fruits and nuts and the animals they killed. They had no bread or rice because they did not grow anything in the fields. They did not know cooking, but perhaps they just heated the meat on the big fires they had. They had no cooking vessels or pots and pans. One thing is very curious. These savage men knew how to draw. Of course, they had no paper or pen or pencil or brushes. They simply had their stone needles and pointed instruments. With these, they sketched or drew animals on the walls of caves. Some of their drawings are quite good, but they are almost all profiles. You know that it is easier to draw profiles, and children usually draw in this way. As the caves must have been dark, it is possible that they used some kind of simple lamp. These men that you have described are called Paleolithic men, or the men of the old Stone Age. That period is called Stone Age because men made all their tools with stone. They did not know how to use metals. Today, most of our things are made of metals, especially iron. But iron or bronze was not known then. And so stone, which is much more difficult to work with, was used. Before the Stone Age came to an end, the climate of the world changed greatly and became much warmer. The glaciers had gone far back to the Arctic Ocean, and in Central Asia and Europe, great forests arose. Among these forests, we find a new race of men living. These people were cleverer in many ways than the Paleolithic man, whom we have just described. But they still made their tools out of stone. These men also belonged to the Stone Age, but it was the later Stone Age. They are called Neolithic men or men of the New Stone Age. We find when examining these Neolithic men that great progress has been made. The intelligence of men is making him go ahead fast compared to the other animals. These Neolithic men made the very great discovery of cultivation. They started tilling fields and growing their food there. This was a great thing for them. They could now get their food more easily instead of having to hunt animals all the time. They got more leisure, more time to rest and think. And the more leisure they had, the more progress they made in discovering new things and methods. They started making earthen pots, and with the help of these, they began to cook their food. The stone tools were much better and were beautifully polished. They also knew how to tame animals like the cow, the dog, the sheep, and the goat. They also knew how to weave. They used to live in houses or huts. These huts were very often made in the middle of lakes, as the wild animals or other men could not attack them easily there. These people are therefore called lake dwellers. You will wonder how we know so much about these people. They wrote no books, of course, but I have already told you that the book where we read the story of these men is the great book of nature. It is not easy to read it. It requires great patience. Many people have spent their lives in trying to read this book, and they have collected large number of fossils and other remainings of old times. These fossils are collected together in the great museums, and we can see there the fine polished axes and the pots and stone arrows and needles and many other things which were made by the Neolithic man. You have seen many of these things yourself, but perhaps you have forgotten them. If you see them again, you will be able to understand them better. There was, I remember, a very good model of a lake dwelling in the Geneva Museum. Wooden poles were stuck in the lake, and on top of these poles a wooden platform was made. On the platform the wooden huts were put up, and the thing was connected by a little bridge to the land. These Neolithic men clothed themselves with the skin of animals, or sometimes with a rough cloth of flax. Flax is a plant which has a good fiber used for making cloth. Linen is now made of flax. But those days, cloth of flax must have been very rough. These men went on making progress. They started making tools of copper and of bronze. Bronze, as you know, is a mixture of copper and tin and is harder than either of these. They also used gold and were vain enough to make ornaments out of it. These people must have lived about 10,000 years ago. Of course, we do not know the exact date or periods. All this is largely guesswork. You will notice that so far we have been talking of millions of years. We are now gradually getting nearer and nearer to our present age. From the Neolithic man to the man today, there is no break or sudden change. But still, we are very different from them. The changes came slowly, as in nature's way. Different races developed, and each race went its own way and lived its own life. The climate being different in different parts of the world, people had to adapt themselves to it and changed greatly. But we shall talk about this later. One thing more I want to tell you today about the end of the Neolithic age. A very great disaster happened to man. I have told you already that at that time the Mediterranean was not a sea at all. There was just some lakes there, and in these lakes many people lived. Suddenly the land near Gibraltar between Europe and Africa was washed away, and the waters of the Atlantic Ocean poured into the low valley of the Mediterranean. The water went on pouring and filling it up, and large numbers of the men and women living near or over the lakes must have been drowned. They could not escape anywhere. There was water all over the place for thousands of miles. The Atlantic Ocean continued to pour in till it had filled up the valley, and the Mediterranean Sea came into existence. You have heard, of course, and perhaps read about the Great Flood. The Bible speaks about it, and some of our Sanskrit books also refer to it. It may be that this mighty flood was the filling up of the Mediterranean. It was such a terrible disaster that few people who managed to escape must have told all about it to their children, and they too their own children. And so the story was handed down from generation to generation. Letter 8. How different races were formed. We discussed in our last letter the Neolithic men who used to live chiefly in lake dwellings. We saw that they had made great progress in many ways. They discovered agriculture and knew how to cook and to tame animals for their use. All this was many thousands of years ago, and we do not know much about them. But probably most of the races of men we have in the world today have descended from these Neolithic people. We find now, as you know, white men and yellow men and brown and black. But as a matter of fact, it is not easy to divide the races of men into these four divisions. Races have got mixed up, and it is difficult to say about many of them to which division they belong. Scientists measure the heads of people, and by this measurement they can sometimes find out the race. There are other ways to finding this out as well. How did these different races come into existence? If they are all descended from the same people, why do they differ so much from each other now? You know that a German is very different from a Negro. One is fair and the other is black. The hair of the German is light colored and long. The Negro's hair is black and short and curly. The Chinaman, again, is different from both of these. It is difficult to say how these differences crept in, but we know some of these causes of these differences. I have already told you how animals gradually changed as they adapted themselves to their surroundings. It may be that the German and the Negro are descended from different types of men, but sometime or other they must have had the same ancestor. The differences must therefore have come in by the process of adaptation to their surroundings. Or it may have been that some, like some animals, could adapt themselves more easily than others. Thus, a person living in the great cold and ice of the far north would develop the power to bear cold. The Eskimos even now live in the ice fields of the north and they can bear great cold. They could probably die if you brought them to warm countries like ours. And as they are cut off from the rest of the world and have to live a hard life, they have not learned as many things as people in the other parts of the world. The people in Africa, or those living near the equator where it is very hot, get used to the heat, and the great heat of the sun makes them dark in complexion. You know that if you spend much time in the sun at the seaside or elsewhere, you become tanned or browner and darker than you otherwise are. If after a few weeks of sunbaths you become darker, how much darker would be a man who always has to live in the sun? And if for hundreds of years people live in very hot countries, fathers and their children and their children's children and so on, they will become darker and darker till they become most black. You have seen the Indian peasant working in the fields in the midday sun. He is too poor to have many clothes and has little on. His whole body is exposed to the sun, and all his life is spent in this way. He is bound to get dark. So you find that people's complexions are the result of the climate they live in. They have nothing to do with the worthiness or goodness or beauty of a person. A white person living long in a hot country will get dark unless, of course, he hides himself from the sun and the heat behind tatties and other fans. You know, we are Kashmiris, and more than 200 years ago, our ancestors lived in Kashmir. In Kashmir, you find everybody, including the peasants and laborers, very fair of complexion. That is because the climate of Kashmir is cold. But these very Kashmiris, when they come down to other parts of India, which are hotter, become darker after some generations. Many of our Kashmiri friends are quite fair, others are quite dark. The longer a Kashmiri family has lived in this part of India, the darker it is likely to be. Climate is thus the chief cause of color and complexion. Of course, it may be that some people, even though they may live in a hot country, do not work in the open and are rich enough to live in big houses and take care of themselves and their complexions. A rich family may live like this for generations and may thus not be affected by the climate very much. But not to work oneself and to live on the work of others is nothing to be proud of. In India, you find that in the north, in Kashmir and Punjab, people are usually fair, but as you go south, they become darker. In Madras and Ceylon, as you saw, they are quite dark. Of course, you will say that this is due to the climate, for as you go south, you go nearer to the equator and becomes hotter. This is quite true and is the principal reason for the difference of color in various parts of India. We shall see, however, later that this difference is partly also due to some difference in the original races which came to India. Many races have come to India in past stages, and although for long they tried to keep apart, they could not help mixing together. It is difficult now to say that a particular Indian belongs entirely to one original race. Hello friends, you are listening to Letters from a Father to His Daughter by Jawaharlal Nehru. Please tune into Chhuti Presents Escape into Audio Stories for other episodes. Till then, goodbye and stay in touch.